Susan Gardner here for Municipal World. We're at the 2019 AMO Conference in Ottawa, Ontario, and joining me in the Municipal World Media Center is Enid Slack. Enid's a renowned municipal property tax and assessment expert, and also a member of the advisory board for the Municipal World Journal on Assessment and Taxation. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, great presentation this morning.
Thank you.
Market value assessment in Ontario. We've had about 20 years of experience with it now. You shared some reflections on that and why market value assessment is a good thing and why it sometimes gets a bad rap.
That's right.
So tell us about that.
Okay, well, we've actually had market value assessment for much longer than 20 years. The Assessment Act of 1904 said that all properties should be assessed at actual value. But what happened in 1998 was a major property tax reform where the market values were updated to current values. And I guess what I argued in my presentation was that market value may have some problems, but it's the best way to distribute taxes, property taxes, among taxpayers. Firstly, it's fair, and it's perceived to be fair. So if I'm in a house worth $200,000 and you're in a house worth $200,000, we should be paying the same tax. And people look at their neighbors and what their houses are worth and make that comparison. So not only is it fair, it's perceived by people to be fair. An alternative would be an area-based system where you just look at the size of the property and tax on that basis. But again, that's not necessarily fair because you could have a big property, but it's not worth very much. And so that wouldn't be fair.
You gave a great example of a similar sized property next to a beautiful park and one that's next to a slaughterhouse.
Right.
And obviously, you know, my home next to a beautiful park is probably worth more. I should be paying more in taxes for that.
That's right. And that's another argument, which is the location is very important. And in an area-based system, you wouldn't necessarily look at location. And I also mentioned the point that the property tax is a form of land value capture. So if the government invests in parks or transit or street lighting, sidewalks, that's reflected in your property value. And so it makes sense to be paying taxes on the basis of your property value to reflect the costs of services that the government has provided.
So what are some of the other alternative systems that folks sometimes suggest are perhaps better solutions?
Well, some countries use what's called an area-based system. So you are taxing on the basis of the size of the property. So there might be an assessment per square meter of land and an assessment per square meter of building size, and you add them up and you get a property tax. That's used a lot in Central and Eastern Europe, where there historically hasn't been a market in housing. So you can't estimate a market value if there is no market. And so they have historically used an area-based system. But even they are trying to move to a market-based system, trying to assess the market value of properties. They do that in part by doing a unit value system. So you take the area basis, but you may adjust it for location, or you may adjust it for the quality of the building or the age of the building. And so you can add a lot of factors to an area-based system, which sort of get you a little closer to market value. But as I also mentioned, in a country like the Netherlands, where they kept putting more factors and more factors and more factors to make it look more like market value, they realized that it was just simpler to use a market value system and not be trying to add all these different arbitrary factors.
They're really trying to capture market value,
right,
by putting all these other controls in place.
That's right. So why not just try to estimate market value?
You talked also about the Republic of Ireland.
Right.
And I'm sure that caught some people's attention, self-assessment.
Right. Well, again, the history in the Republic of Ireland is in the mid-70s, they got rid of the residential property tax. We can talk about that, whether that was a good idea or not, but when they tried to bring it back a few years ago, it takes time to set up a market value system, and so they allow for self-assessment. It's not like I just guess at the value of my property. You fill out a form which looks at the different factors that would determine your market value, and you kind of check them off. And then you say, well, why would I be higher than that, or why would I be lower than that? And so you come out with an estimate based on a template. But then the assessment department can come in and say, no, that's not the right amount. And they talk about that. So you can't just go and assess on your own. In some countries, what they've done, and it's not that widely used, but it is used. Some South American countries use it. The stipulation is you assess the value of your property, but you have to be prepared to sell your property to the city for that amount, or that amount within a range. And so that, of course, makes you a little bit more honest, because you're not going to sell your property for a value that's less than you think it's worth.
That's a good control to keep you honest.
Yes, I think so.
So tax increment financing. What is tax increment financing?
So tax increment financing is a land value capture tool. It's used largely in U.S. jurisdictions, and it was set up originally to revitalize the downtowns of American cities that were not doing very well. And so what they do is they set a boundary of the area they want to redevelop. And they look at the property taxes before they do anything else. And that's called day zero. What are the property taxes? Then they invest in that neighborhood, put in a lot of infrastructure. Usually they borrow the money to pay for this infrastructure. So you would expect over time the property values would go up and the property taxes would go up. Sure. And so they look at the original property taxes on day zero, and they watch the increment in property taxes arising from that development. They take that increment and use it to pay back the money they borrowed for the infrastructure. So it's a land value capture tool because that investment has increased the land values, and they use that money to pay off for the infrastructure. But it's a property tax, right? It's right. Just a property tax that's earmarked. The increase is earmarked to pay for that infrastructure.
Okay. So it's not an alternative to property tax in any way. It is in fact.
It is a property tax.
A property tax.
That's right.
Okay. So we hear a lot of people talk about the municipal toolbox and how the toolbox is insufficient, and some people take that to mean that that the property tax is an outdated tool, and communities need a better tool. What's your opinion on that?
Well, as I said in my presentation, I think the property tax is a really good tax for local governments. It provides a stable and predictable source of revenue. Property can't move, so when you raise the tax, you still have a tax base. It's as we just talked about, it's closely related to the benefits you receive from local government services. It's a very visible tax that makes it accountable. People know what they pay in property taxes. That makes local governments accountable. There are a number of reasons why I think the property tax is a good tax for local government. But I think the issue is that the local governments today provide a very wide range of services, a lot of different services, and they have different characteristics. And depending on those characteristics, different revenues are more appropriate. So for example, things like water and transit, we can identify who uses those services. We can exclude those who don't pay. And so a user fee, at least for part of the cost of transit, maybe all of the cost of water, are appropriate. And so for that sort of bucket of expenditures, I think user fees make the most sense. There are other services that have collective benefits where we know who the beneficiaries on average, but we don't know the individual ones, like street lighting or policing services, fire, parks. So these are things where the property tax makes sense. They are benefits. They're benefits to the community, but we can't charge user fees for them. And that's why the property tax is good. But local governments are always also doing a lot of social services, what we call redistributive services, where we're redistributing from high-income households to low-income households, whether it's childcare or other social services. Those don't really belong on the property tax. Those are redistributive services. The best tax for redistribution is an income tax, and so that those kinds of services should come from income tax revenues. Then there are services that spill over municipal boundaries. So, for example, I build a road. People in the neighboring municipalities use it. Why would I pay for the whole thing when they're beneficiaries in other municipalities? And that may be a role for the provincial government to say, well, 30% of the benefits spill over. We'll give you a transfer for 30% of the cost. So you can look at the different characteristics of the services local governments provide, and different tools are appropriate for those different characteristics. So the property tax is very important, and maybe it could bring in more money than it does, but I think the issue is more what kinds of tools should be used for what kinds of services.
So property tax is still an important part of the toolbox.
Very.
But they need some other tools to complement it as well to get the job done. Because as you said, it's a very complex selection of services that municipalities require.
That's right.
So let's let's talk about the freeze. Yeah, is it a good idea? You talked about Proposition 13, California. What was that?
Right. Well, back in the mid-1970s, property values were rising quite rapidly in California. And unlike Ontario, they didn't have a policy of lowering tax rates when property values went up, and so the property tax revenues kept increasing, and there was a tax revolt. And so they brought in Proposition 13, which capped the assessment increase at, 2% or the rate of inflation, something like that, until you sold the property. So it was a freeze, basically, on assessments. So I don't think that's a very good idea. We have capping in Ontario on business properties, although we've been slowly getting out of that program over time. But what it does, it rewards those whose property values are going up at the expense of those whose property values are stagnant. So I'm doing very well, thank you very much, and I'm being subsidized by somebody who isn't. The other issue is that over time, people who stay in their houses, for seniors, for example, who've been in their houses for a long time, take advantage of this program. But if you're a new home buyer, you go right to market value. So you've basically got seniors doing very well, first-time home buyers not doing very well. So that's an unfairness that goes on for generations. And lastly, it's very hard to get out of. I quoted an author from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Joan Youngman, who says, once you put on a freeze, the thaw is just too painful to bear. Once you do this, it's very hard to get out of it. It's hard to say to people, okay, we've capped your increases and now we're taking that away and you're going to face the full impact of a reassessment. That's very hard to do. So my advice, don't get into it in the first place.
Don't go down that road.
Don't go down that road.
So on the kind of on the other side of the property tax equation, because you highlighted as well that people often don't understand that assessment is only one part of the equation. The tax rate is the other, and that's what gives you your property taxes.
That's right.
Communities that choose for whatever reason to decrease the property tax or to commit to a zero property tax increase. What's your opinion on that?
Well, that's a lot of things go into that decision. So I can't speak for the people who make those decisions. I think you look at your budget for the year, the expenditures you want to make. You look at all the revenues you have available, and then you net them out, and that determines how much you have to raise from the property tax. You look at the assessment base, and you strike a tax rate that will yield the revenues you want to collect. And if you decide you're going to keep the tax rate at a zero increase or at the rate of inflation, that will have an impact on the expenditures you make, and that's a political decision, right?
Yes, yeah. So some choices that have to be made in every community.
That's right.
And a good thing to be talking to ratepayers about, perhaps.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing this with us, and congratulations on a great presentation as always at AMO.
Thank you very much.
I'm Susan Gardner from Municipal World, here with Enid Slack. We share your stories.